Special guest today, but I want to give you a little context first. Peace is in our name for a reason. This is an organization that is devoted to understanding what drives peace and conflict. And when there are agreements that reduce violence, that increase the possibility for prosperity, we have particular interest. We want to understand those agreements. We want to understand the conditions that bring them about. So it should be no surprise that we have a great interest here at Carnegie in the Good Friday agreements and the impact that they've had on the Republic of Ireland, on Northern Ireland, on Europe, and in fact on the world as an inspiration. But these are challenging times for the world and for peace and for the agreements that have been forged over decades when it comes to reducing conflict. So as we reflect a bit on where the Good Friday agreements are, it's impossible to ignore the context. Brexit, a resurgent degree of violence in Europe, fraying of the international order, increasing tensions around economics and governance domestically, and ultimately really deep questions about where the world is going and how it holds together the commitments that have reduced violence over generations. We are fortunate today to have somebody with us who is absolutely the person to speak about where the Good Friday agreements are, what the context is for those agreements, and other issues that are facing Europe at this time. It's my great honor to introduce Simon Coveney, the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Defence for the Republic of Ireland. I should note that he is handling two ministries, not just one, definitely an overachiever. He's also somebody who has demonstrated his acumen as a member of the European Parliament, as Taoiseach in the Government of Ireland, as a member of the Irish Parliament, as Minister for Agriculture and Marine, as the person, in fact, in charge of handling Brexit for the Republic of Ireland. I'm also very happy that he's going to be in conversation after giving some remarks with Sophia Besh from our Europe program. Sophia will, after the minister gives some remarks, she'll ask questions, she'll explore various topics. But I want to end my introduction by just highlighting a little bit of personal context. My wife is of Korean-American heritage. I'm of Mexican-American heritage. So for the two of us, like for so many Americans who travel to Ireland, we found a great deal of kinship in Ireland. We found ourselves thinking about the connection between Ireland and the United States. We also found ourselves reflecting on the connection between the lands where my family comes from and my wife comes from, and the history of Ireland as a vibrant, extraordinary culture in a complex geopolitical neighborhood. But I want to add one more detail, which is I had the privilege of serving 7 years on the California Supreme Court. And there is an Ireland-California connection I want to highlight, and that is every morning, Wednesday, when my colleagues and I would gather for what we called conference, where we discussed what cases to grant review on, I had the pleasure of getting to know extremely well my 6 other colleagues on the California Supreme Court. And one of them, Justice Carol Corrigan, had a family that hailed from Ireland. And in that few minutes of banter that occurred almost every Wednesday morning before we had the difficult cases, actually the banter was longer when the cases were more complicated, there'd be a little bit of back and forth about any number of topics, about what movies people were watching, what was happening up and down the state. But one member of the court, Justice Corrigan, was rather consistent in the topic she brought up. She always wanted to start that banter by discussing how wonderful Ireland was, the collective virtues of County Cork, County Galway, and where she thought she was going to go the next time she happened to be able to travel to the Republic of Ireland. And I did find myself noticing that every time she did bring up Ireland, our conversations about the cases were a little smoother. So please join me in welcoming the minister and join me in thanking him not only for what he's done coming to Carnegie, but what Ireland has done for California. Thank you and welcome.
And the Carnegie Endowment for hosting today's event. We are gathering here in turbulent and difficult times under the shadows of war, hunger, climate change, and many other pressures too. an era in which the multilateral system is undoubtedly under strain, challenging diplomacy and diplomats to do better. I'd be happy, of course, to take questions on all global issues or whatever's on your mind during the discussion later on. It's important in times such as these that those of us who want to see diplomacy deliver draw hope and inspiration from success. Sometimes we forget that actually we have had a lot of success as well as the challenges we continue to struggle with. I'll therefore frame my remarks today around one significant success, the achievement of peace on the island that I call home in Northern Ireland, and the relationship, I should say, between both parts of that island, north and south. I'll also reflect on the ongoing work needed to ensure that the continuing benefits of that peace are delivered. Framing, negotiating, and consolidating the Good Friday Agreement required brave leadership and gifted statesmanship at the time. Great people, such as John Hume and David Trimble, who together were awarded the Nobel Prize for their contribution to peace on the island of Ireland, made that possible. Both have passed away over the past few years, but their legacy does endure. But here in Washington, D.C., it's also important to recall that peace in Ireland was, in many ways, made in America. John Hume said in his Nobel address, "We in Ireland appreciate this solidarity and support from the United States, from the European Union, from friends around the world, more than we can say. The achievement of peace could not have been won without this goodwill and generosity of spirit." Next April will mark 25 years since the Good Friday Agreement was signed and then endorsed by an overwhelming majority of people on the island of Ireland. Let's not forget that this is the people's agreement that they voted for. Referendums held in both jurisdictions were a collective endorsement of peace and the politics of peace and compromise. In the 25 years since 1998, relationships within Northern Ireland, on the whole of the island of Ireland, and between the islands east and west have been reset. We have enjoyed a quarter of a century during which an entire generation was born and has come to adulthood free from the shadow of violence and intimidation. That owes much to the generosity of spirit abundant through generations of US policymakers from both sides of the aisle. That generosity and that interest continues strongly today. There is a thread of passionate, principled, and engaged leaders running from President Reagan in the 1980s to President Biden today. I do not take the bipartisan nature of this support for granted. We meet here a week after the midterm elections, and let's face it, the difficult campaigns that preceded them. I know that the common ground of US politics has narrowed. There are fewer bipartisan issues today. But I'm grateful that Ireland, peace on the island of Ireland, can still be counted as a cross-party issue that both parties support. Peace is often described as a process, not an event. We are at a moment now when peace in Northern Ireland needs attention. It needs to be tended to, and it needs to be nurtured. The last several years have required us to navigate challenges never foreseen by the architects of the Good Friday Agreement. It was clear from the outset that the UK's decision to leave the EU had the potential to be profoundly disruptive for Northern Ireland and for the island of Ireland as a whole. And so it has been. That both the UK and Ireland were member states of the EU underpinned the genius at the heart of that agreement, the ability to be both British and Irish at the same time, or choose to be one or the other. It meant that both the UK and Ireland shared a body of law, human rights protections, and were both part of Europe's single market from a trade perspective, which rendered trade borders invisible on the island. Decisions made in London about the type of relationship it wanted with the EU into the future meant that my government, working with our EU partners, has had to work hard to protect the gains of the Good Friday Agreement. This resulted in a special set of arrangements for Northern Ireland within the new EU-UK relationship, negotiated by Boris Johnson's administration a number of years ago. Those arrangements agreed, known as the Protocol, recognise Northern Ireland's unique position. They explicitly acknowledge and affirm the Good Friday Agreement. It is my view, and the view of many in Northern Ireland, that the Protocol offers real opportunities for Northern Ireland's people and businesses. Opportunities which are being realised by many businesses even today. However, there are some, particularly within the unionist community, who have articulated genuine concerns over the Protocol and its implementation. Together with the responsible EU Commissioner, Vice President Maroš Šefčovič, I have engaged consistently with respect and attention across Northern Ireland, including with the unionist community and the business community, to understand their perspectives and to try to respond to them. A complication has been the decision by the UK to bring forward legislation that, if enacted, would unilaterally break its agreement with the EU on Northern Ireland and also break its word to the Irish government. This has damaged trust, and it's important to be upfront about that. That has been compounded by a failure for most of this year to have UK negotiators empowered to work with their EU counterparts to find solutions through compromise, pragmatism, and flexibility. In the absence of progress, politics in Northern Ireland has simply broken down. With no executive or assembly in place, no north-south bodies in place for quite some time, and of course efforts to try to maintain the relationship east-west between the two governments. 6 months on from elections, formation of the institutions continues to be blocked by one party. The people of Northern Ireland deserve much better than this political limbo, particularly at a time when they feel the very same pressures that those across the UK and in the Republic of Ireland feel in terms of cost of living and so on. I appreciate the concerns that lie behind the DUP position. However, there is, in my view, no justification for preventing the democratically elected representatives of Northern Ireland from assuming their responsibilities and governing their own people. I have a good relationship with the new Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Chris Heaton-Harris. Chris last week delayed elections in Northern Ireland to allow time for London to negotiate with the EU on open and unresolved issues. It's important that this time is now not wasted. I know that this is something our friends in Washington also want. The EU has always shown flexibility in its approach to finding solutions and will continue to do so. I believe we can bridge the gaps that exist if there is sufficient political will to do so in London. A lasting, stable, and sustainable resolution of these issues will be good for Northern Ireland, it'll be good for Ireland, it'll be good for the UK, and good for the EU. Resolution will enable a partnership that sees EU and UK working together in partnership, as opposed to the kind of standoffs that we've seen relating to these issues in recent years. Working to enhance the lives of our citizens, supporting our business and delivering together in opposition to those who would undermine the rule of law and democracy is where we need to be. More broadly, the impasse in Northern Ireland points to fragilities which must be addressed, fragilities which require positive leadership from the front. The kind of statesmanship which Trimble and Hume showed 25 years ago is needed again. And the support of friends for leaders who challenge their own in order to deliver a reconciled society is also needed. Refusing to stand up Northern Ireland's institutions instead of providing day-to-day leadership and delivery is, in my view, the easy option. Failing to challenge voices within your own community that do not want to see politics work is the easy option. Northern Ireland has never been best served by those who take the easy option. The Good Friday Agreement was built by those from traditions who rejected that easy option and were willing to take risks and show leadership. It was built by leaders who embraced the hard work and difficult compromises that were necessary for peace, necessary for Northern Ireland to achieve its true potential, which still lies ahead of it. To borrow the words of President Clinton, speaking in Belfast 3 years before the Good Friday Agreement, leaders make compromises and are willing to risk the backlash. We are indebted to the leaders of the 1998 agreement who did just that. Such courage is required in Northern Ireland again today, and the challenges are certainly not as significant or as difficult as they were then, now. Its leaders will have to confront the expectations and demands of some of their own support base. They must end this stasis and return to the Assembly and Executive. They must show that politics can and does work for all communities in Northern Ireland. In doing so, they are standing up for Northern Ireland, showing that Northern Ireland itself can and does work under a peace agreement that many made significant sacrifices to achieve. The reward for such bravery is clear. A Northern Ireland that can look with confidence and hope to the next 25 years, which we hope will be very different and more positive than what we've seen in the past. The work of peace is the work of generations. It is incumbent upon us, our generation, to keep it moving forward. Next April, we will celebrate the success of the Good Friday Agreement in ending political violence and establishing power sharing based on mutual respect and common purpose. We will celebrate the essential contribution of our friends here in the United States and elsewhere to make that possible and to set a context that allowed for the compromise that delivered that successful agreement. I hope we can celebrate it alongside elected officials in Northern Ireland, assuming the privileges and responsibilities of leadership. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Minister, welcome again. We're so delighted that you're here with us this morning, especially because I understand that you're only in Washington, D.C. for a day. It's a short trip, and we're really glad that you're making a stop here.
Thank you.
Good morning to everyone in the room, and welcome also to those who are joining us virtually. I want to say in the beginning that we are planning to leave some time for questions. We will have a mic in the room, and we'll also take questions from those of you joining virtually. I think you can put them in the comment section of the YouTube video. But Minister, I've found myself really quite moved by the urgency of your remarks there and by your framing of looking back at the success of the Good Friday Agreement as hopefully an inspiration for negotiators today. You said that peace is the work of generations, and I think you've laid out what might be the biggest challenges of that work for your generation of Irish leaders today. So I want to start by talking about Brexit and the fallout of Brexit on the island of Ireland. I was working in London and another think tank over the course of the Brexit referendum, and it was remarkable to me how little Northern Ireland featured in the campaigns of the Leavers and of the Remainers. Shortly after the referendum, then there was the realization that there could, of course, not be another highly symbolic land border in Ireland. So we came to this agreement, the Northern Ireland Protocol, that essentially shifts that border to the Irish Sea to do checks on goods there. You've mentioned that because of the tensions over that protocol, we've had the breakdown, essentially, of the power sharing arrangement in Northern Ireland, which is one of the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement. Elections have been postponed again and again. Could you just lay out a little bit the stakes of what that means, that we still haven't had elections, and whether that could lead to tensions in the future if we keep postponing them?
Well, first of all, can I say, often when I come to Washington, I'm reminded that many here in the US see peace on the island of Ireland as one of the US's most significant foreign policy achievements in the last 50 years. If you look around the world at peace processes, not many of them succeed. Some of them last for a few years and then they collapse in acrimony or whatever. So first of all, getting this agreement against the odds at the time, very, very few people predicted that it was likely to happen when it did. And then sustaining it for 25 years, with all of its flaws and breakdowns and challenges that we've had at different times, has been a remarkable success. And it remains a remarkable success today. And it is an inspiration for other parts of the world that are torn by conflict, who are trying to find ways where two sides or more can accommodate each other's perspectives in political structures that can function. So I often talk about the peace process in Ireland in the context of global challenges, not just the context of British-Irish relations or the relationships on the island of Ireland. The problem with Brexit, and we knew it as soon as the debates on Brexit started, in relation to peace and normality on the island of Ireland, was that in many ways the peace process on the island of Ireland was about convergence. It was about being, both sides of the island being in the European Union together, sharing a regulatory environment that was the same. The peace process provided an absence of violence, and therefore the security on the border was no longer needed. EU membership provided a shared economic regulatory environment, which meant there was no need for any border infrastructure. And so this shared EU membership allowed for this sort of creation of convergence through trade and relationships and so on. Brexit, unfortunately, is all about divergence. It's the opposite. It's about the United Kingdom deciding it's different, it wants to do things differently, it wants to break from the parameters of EU membership and do its own thing. And so whatever about Great Britain, for Northern Ireland, we knew that would create huge challenges on the island because the peace process was really about the opposite to all of that. It was about people leaving their differences aside and agreeing to work together in agreed areas. And here we had this issue, which was a deliberate policy of actually forcing difference on people in terms of identity, in terms of nationality, in terms of trade, in terms of regulatory environment, and so on. And so for us, for Northern Ireland not to be one of the sort of centre points of discussion and negotiation around the Brexit challenges, in most of the debate in Great Britain was a huge frustration, because we knew it was going to be really, really problematic. And so it has been. Mm-hmm. 6 years on, we're still talking about it. And so in the end, the way to address the Ireland question, as it was referred to in Westminster, was, Theresa May had an approach which didn't differentiate Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK at all. That was rejected by the Conservative Party, and in particular by Boris Johnson in terms of his leadership. He became Prime Minister, and then it was his proposal to Brussels that became then known as the Northern Ireland Protocol, to treat Northern Ireland effectively as a unique challenge that needed to be overcome with a solution that was Northern Ireland specific. And what that was, in simple terms, was that Northern Ireland, of course, would remain part of the United Kingdom unless that were to change through a democratic decision under the Good Friday Agreement structures. It would stay part of the United Kingdom, but it would also remain as part of the EU's single market for goods. And in that way, there would be no need for any border infrastructure on the island of Ireland between North and South. And the cost of that, if you like, politically, was that there would need to be some checks then on goods from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, even though that was all of the that was the United Kingdom, but there would be some checks because those goods effectively were coming into the EU single market and could end up in Prague, in Madrid, in Dublin, or in Paris, because that's how the EU single market works. So in order to protect the integrity of the EU single market, there needed to be some understanding of what was coming in from Great Britain, because of course the EU's rules and regulations would no longer apply to those products. And that's essentially now what we're trying to solve. But let's be very clear, because some are trying to rewrite history here. There was a treaty agreed between the EU and the UK, which was very clear in terms of how the protocol would work and would apply. There was an implementation plan agreed a year later with the British government in terms of how that protocol would be implemented. And subsequently now we're seeing a British government looking to change all of that, which is essentially to change international law. And so the EU is being confronted with trying to respond to that, to show pragmatism and flexibility, and to acknowledge concerns and so on, which are legitimate concerns from some in Northern Ireland. And in essence, what we're trying to do now is we're trying to apply the minimal level of checks required, particularly on goods that are staying in Northern Ireland and we can show are being purchased and consumed in Northern Ireland, in other words, staying within the United Kingdom, and are not at risk of moving on to other parts of the EU single market. And we're doing everything we can to virtually remove as much or as many of those checks as possible, or largely to make them invisible, so that the trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland that's staying within the UK's single market is not disrupted in any way that's not absolutely necessary. So it's a complicated negotiation, but actually what it comes down to is identity, and identity-based politics, where unionists in Northern Ireland feel that their Britishness is being undermined because Northern Ireland has a different regulatory environment potentially to the rest of the United Kingdom because of the protocol's facilitation, if you like, of Northern Ireland being part of an extended EU single market for goods. Look, I mean, I can go into the detail of that. I've probably gone into too much of the detail of it already, but I just think it's from a US audience base, it's important to know this deal was done a number of years ago. It involved compromise on all sides, and the British government has subsequently looked to try to undo that deal, and we are trying to accommodate that as much as possible. But we've also got to ensure that Ireland's place in the EU single market, north and south, is not undermined by the solutions that we look to find. In other words, we've got to protect the integrity of the EU single market in all of this, while responding to unionist concerns and business concerns as best we can in Northern Ireland.
Thank you. I think you've done a beautiful job, actually, of not getting too technical. These talks can get very technical very quickly. I want to hold on a couple of the points you brought up. One was this idea of identity and how those issues of identity have been inflamed by the Brexit process. Because we have seen surveys in Northern Ireland over the past few years that show that actually there's a large number of people that don't subscribe to this binary opposition anymore of political identity, nationalists, unionists. Do you think that that process could lead to a different kind of power sharing agreement in the future?
Possibly, yes. So in the elections we had a few months ago, this electorate that doesn't want to be classified as unionist or nationalist, they don't want a label on their back, they want to prioritise other issues in Northern Ireland around quality of life, around opportunities and improved community relations and so on. They're about 17% now of the electorate, which is not a small figure. And in truth, there is no majority for nationalism or unionism any longer.
Yeah.
So everybody is in a minority in Northern Ireland, and they need to get their heads around that.
Yeah.
Because that hasn't been the case for one community for most of Northern Ireland's history. I think that is a contributing factor to instability. Northern Ireland trying to find a new political equilibrium, if you like, where nobody is dominant, nobody's in the majority, and everybody has to work and try and accommodate each other's concerns as best we can. And unfortunately, if that were not a big enough challenge in itself, layering in Brexit and the protocol questions on top of that, and the identity-based political interpretation of the challenges that we have to overcome, has made it difficult. And so the largest unionist party in Northern Ireland, who represents somewhere between sort of 25 and 29% of voters in Northern Ireland, have effectively said, until the protocol issues are resolved, we are not going to be part of devolved government and the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement. That is hugely problematic, because it's a minority effectively forcing its will on the large majority in Northern Ireland who do want a functioning executive, but it is where we are. And so one of the ways in which we can solve that, even though I don't accept the legitimacy of the position that there should be no devolved government in Northern Ireland. I mean, I think we could do both at the same time, put it that way. But certainly it would be helpful if we could resolve the protocol issues, and I think there'll be a big effort to try and do that before the end of the year.
Yeah.
The new British Prime Minister and the new look cabinet that he has around him are giving clear signals that they want a negotiated solution rather than some kind of unilateral interpretation of what a solution might look like from London, which in my view, and I think in most people's view, would actually cause an awful lot more problems than it would solve, and ultimately potentially lead to a lot of friction between the UK and the EU, which is, to be honest, the last thing we need in the context of other things that are happening in the continent of Europe right now.
Absolutely. Yeah, so let me ask you about the dynamic of these negotiations, because you've played such an important role in them and talks have just resumed. You mentioned that there's a new government in the UK. There has been a little bit of turnover recently. And Rishi Sunak is, a staunch Brexiteer, but he's also a pragmatist. He's inheriting a difficult economic situation. He might not have an interest in a trade war with the European Union. So do you think there is an opening now under this government?
I do. I mean, just to give you a sense of the extent of the turnover, and I don't mean that in any kind of a patronizing or a critical way, but from an Irish perspective, we've been trying to resolve these issues with, in my time as a Minister for Foreign Affairs, which is a privilege that I've had for over 5 years now, I've worked with 6 Secretaries of State for Northern Ireland, 5 Foreign Secretaries and 4 Prime Ministers in 5 years. So just to give you a sense of the numbers of people, which of course are always disruptive in terms of trying to find compromise and agreement in a complex negotiation, because personal relationships and trust is what delivers in politics. Mm-hmm. If you're looking from the outside, politicians need to understand and know each other before they can do deals together. And so that turnover of personalities and the pressure on all of those individual personalities to try and find a way forward from the political internal pressures in London within the Conservative Party have been a real driver of instability. I think, to be fair to the current Prime Minister, he is trying now to, and has sent very clear signals to Dublin and to Brussels that under his leadership he wants to try and find a way of getting a negotiated solution. That doesn't mean that he doesn't have to drive a hard bargain. He will, because there are issues that the British government want resolved that are difficult to resolve. But my relationship with the new Secretary of State for Northern Ireland is a very good one. Chris Heaton-Harris, I know him from my time in the European Parliament. We're a similar age and get on very well on a personal level. James Cleverly, who's the new Secretary of State, the new Foreign Secretary, I've also had some really positive initial meetings with. And of course, the Taoiseach has met the Prime Minister as well, as of course has President Biden in recent days. So, the mood music is a lot better than it was before, but ultimately this is about a legal agreement.
Yeah.
You know, it's not about warm commentary. That's helpful too, by the way. But ultimately, there are complex issues that need to be overcome. You know, the role of the ECJ, how state aid rules will work in Northern Ireland, how VAT rules will work in Northern Ireland, how we deal with sanitary and phytosanitary checks in Northern Ireland, how we deal with customs and customs management on goods coming into Northern Ireland. I mean, you know, these are the technical issues that need, you know, I often refer to it as sort of pragmatism and flexibility, but within the parameters of the legal agreement that's been signed and is now international law. I think, by the way, there is a landing zone that both sides can accept. Having been around these issues for years, I really do think there is, but it requires political will and it requires compromise on both sides. And I think the EU has shown a willingness to compromise and has been doing that for a number of months now. We need that shared willingness to compromise coming from the British government as well. And if we do that, I think it is possible to get an agreement by the end of the year. And then that would allow us lead into the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement on the 10th of April, having effectively reconstructed, if you like, the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement, which is ultimately about serving people in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
And so there'll be a lot of effort in the next few weeks to deliver that.
Yeah. If I can just press you a little bit on what that compromise might look like, especially with regards to where the EU might be willing to compromise on what issues, and also whether you see, I mean, you clearly do, you seem optimistic, a possibility that the hardline unionists in Northern Ireland will accept anything short of the removal of the protocol.
Yeah, well, when I say I'm optimistic, I mean, I am more optimistic than I have been for quite some time, but I'm still also realistic. I mean, just to say, I mean, let's not be naive either. Sure. If this was easy to solve, it would have been solved long ago. I think there is a willingness to have a real go at trying to get this done. I think if the British government, for the first time in many, many months, gives a green light to their negotiators to try and get a deal done, I think the EU will respond with generosity to that. In fact, I know they will. Okay, speaking to the EU team on a regular basis, I know they will. They want to get this thing done. They want to move past Brexit, move past the protocol issues, so that we can focus on working together on some of these other huge issues that are destabilizing the world at the moment. So I think. I mean, look. In essence, the compromise agreement will revolve around treating goods that are coming from Great Britain into Northern Ireland and that we can show are staying in Northern Ireland by sharing trade data. Okay, which both sides are working on a system that can allow that data to be shared in real time. By the way, data sharing was supposed to happen 2 years ago, right? And we're still trying to figure out a way of getting it done. But I think that the EU has certainly shown a willingness to compromise and show flexibility on applying a completely different level of risk management, if you like, to goods that we know are staying in Northern Ireland versus goods that are at risk of coming into the EU single market proper. And to do everything they can to remove as many of the checks and potential trade barriers on those goods as possible. And Maroš Šefčovič has talked about making the checks virtually invisible, which I think is a significant deliverable then for the British government to show that the UK's single market, including Northern Ireland, is being respected, and that unnecessary checks are not being applied on those goods. I think that's the essence of the agreement. And to be fair to unionism in Northern Ireland, they've always said that goods that are coming from GB into Northern Ireland that are then travelling on into the EU, of course they need to be checked. Because they are goods, that's the same as goods coming from GB into France or GB into Spain or whatever. So it's about differentiating those two products and finding a way of doing that that's credible, that the EU can stand over, that protects the EU single market in terms of its integrity, but does everything we can to respect the UK single market and Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom. There are a whole series of side issues then that will need agreement, some of which I've mentioned earlier. But I think the core of the agreement is that differentiation in terms of risk management and checks between those categories of goods that I think will, I hope many in the unionist community will see as a significant step forward. I think there will be some who will never be satisfied. And the history of Northern Ireland will show that there are some who will simply never be part of compromises that are agreed by the mainstream, if you like. But I hope we can keep those to a minimum, and that we can get as much agreement as we possibly can, because Northern Ireland needs and deserves stability. And the absence of devolved government takes us into a place of permanent instability in Northern Ireland, where I think you will see calls coming from different communities and different sides for more radical change that would undermine the basis of the peace agreement that I think so many of us want to protect.
Thank you, Minister. Okay, I want to zoom out just a little bit before we go to questions. And you've mentioned a few times now the grave challenges that Europe is currently facing and that should really focus minds on these negotiations. Ireland, the Irish government has just been sanctioned by Russia, as I understand. Ireland, as many other countries in Europe, I think is undergoing a bit of a reflection process in response to the war in Ukraine over its role, its foreign and defense policy role. Neutrality and non-alignment have long been pillars of Irish foreign and defense policy, but there have been comments recently by yourself, by the Prime Minister, that there might be an evolution there to come. Do you want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is we're not neutral in the war in Ukraine, and we haven't been since its first day. We see this as a blatant breach of international law, a blatant breach of the UN Charter. We see it as aggression from one country towards another. We see this as a military superpower looking to change international borders by force, and willing to inflict extraordinary human suffering on a population in order to do that. We see it as a huge military error of judgment, because I think there was an expectation, and it was outside of Russia too, by the way. The expectation was that this war wouldn't last more than about 10 days, and that Ukrainian cities would simply not be able to resist the enormity of the scale of invasion that they were faced with. They've proven all of us wrong on that in terms of this extraordinary resilience that Ukraine has shown. But no, I mean, Ireland makes no apology for being on the side of international law. And if we're not, well, then effectively we're on the side of the oppressor. If you don't take a stand on something as blatantly clear, in our view, as this issue in terms of the rights and wrongs of it, well then, I think you have to ask yourself some serious questions. So, Irish neutrality is based on military non-alignment. Ireland is not likely to join NATO, but Ireland wants to be an active neutral country. That means we take sides when the evidence is clear. And we've taken sides on other issues too, by the way. And we choose to work with other partners internationally at different times. We've been involved in demining programs in Afghanistan in the past with NATO. We've been in a peacekeeping training mission with the UK in Mali. We've been involved in peacekeeping in southern Lebanon with multiple other countries since the late 1970s. And we've lost 47 of our own people in that mission, which is the highest number of deaths of any country in a peacekeeping mission. So sometimes I think when people see Ireland and they see neutrality, they see that as Ireland sort of looking to cop out or not being involved in the difficult choices in conflict zones around the world. I always look to challenge that perspective. We contribute more to international peacekeeping per head of capita than any other country in Europe. And we're very proud of that. In fact, we've had 50 years of unbroken contributions to peacekeeping in some of the most difficult environments in the world. Do we have a military that is equipped for going to war? No, we don't. We have a relatively small military. They're equipped and trained around peacekeeping, peace interventions, and basic protection of sovereignty. Has this war caused Ireland to question its own capacity around defence and security? Yes, it has. We have gone through a process of getting an independent commission, which had a lot of international expertise as well as national expertise, to look at Ireland's defence and security capacity. And actually, we got that report a few weeks before the war in Ukraine began. So we have both the evidence and data in that Commission's report, as well as an international context that has allowed me to get a political decision from government to certainly embark on the most radical reform and investment program for the Irish Defence Forces that we've ever seen, well, since Irish independence 100 years ago. And that effectively means close to doubling our defence spend over the next 6 years, increasing the number of personnel by close to 40% in our defence forces in that period, and improving our capacity around basic security and defence questions around protecting Irish sovereignty and playing a role in terms of EU security and defence in a way that's credible. So yeah, like every country in the continent of Europe, we are looking now in a very critical way at our own systems and asking the hard questions. And as I say, I'm glad to say, as a foreign minister and as a defence minister, I've managed to get government to agree quite an ambitious plan for increased investment in that space. But look, we're still going to be a small player internationally when it comes to security and defence. But we will be a more credible one, I think, in a few years' time. But coming back to Ukraine, Ireland has been one of the strongest critics of what's happening in Ukraine. We have been one of the countries that has been most proactive in terms of calling for sanctions. That's probably why Russia has responded, in terms of, it's very unusual that a country would pick out Ireland for sort of special treatment in terms of sanctions, given the fact that we are not a member of NATO. But we have been singled out today for that. But we continue to be very vocal. We've also committed a huge amount of resources to supporting Ukraine. So far, 63,000 Ukrainians have come to Ireland for refuge. If you were to have a similar number in terms of per head of population in the US, it would be about 3.5 million. So just to give you a sense, could you imagine if 3.5 million people came to the US over a 6-month period looking for refuge? 80% of those requiring state-provided accommodation. 1 in 4 hotel rooms in Ireland today are taken and paid for by the state to accommodate Ukrainian families. And many of you will know how many hotel rooms there are in Ireland because you visit on a regular basis. So just to give you a sense, I mean, we have, between this year and next, we are planning the provision of about 2 billion euros in terms of cost to support Ukrainians properly who come to Ireland in terms of their needs and supports. So, these aren't small commitments for a country like Ireland. When we've gone from 0 to 1% of our population is now Ukrainian in the space of 6 months. And then we have, which is very unusual for us, we have committed to supporting the Ukrainian military, which is not the kind of thing Ireland does very often in conflicts. In fact, I don't think we've ever done it before. But there is what's called a European Peace Facility, which allows countries in Europe to contribute financially towards military supports. We do limit our military contribution to non-lethal weapons. So it's everything from body armor to helmets to fuel to medical supplies to uniforms to blankets to a whole range of other things. But so far we've contributed almost 60 million euros, or sorry, almost 70 million euros to the Ukrainian military in an effort to try and help them defend themselves and their people. So yeah, I mean, Ireland is not neutral in this war. We are taking sides because we believe that we have a moral obligation to do so, and I don't think we'd be a credible international partner if we didn't.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's really interesting also about the reforms that you are planning, and I'm glad that you highlighted the really highly respected role of Ireland as a peacekeeping nation internationally, because that brings us back to the legacy, I think, of the Good Friday Agreement and how some of that expertise may be founded in your own history and the successful peacekeeping process in your own country. I want to get to questions because I know we have a hard out. You have a full day today. So let's turn to the room and see if we have any questions from the room. Yes, in the second row there. And then here, let's collect 3 maybe. Please.
Good morning, Minister. Allison Jarris McGlynn. I'm with Congressman Mike Quigley from Chicago. Thank you. I recognize the constraints that you will be under when I ask this question, so if you want to pivot, I will preface that.
Thank you.
But you alluded,
Give me permission to do that.
as a fellow government employee, I understand how that works on a panel. You alluded earlier in one of your responses to the democratic process in the North, should they choose a unification effort through democratic means. Obviously, the government is not taking a position on that, but curious if you have any words that you could share to that, and then to give you the out, regionally, with the protracted political crisis in the North, do you have any thoughts on how your neighbors in Scotland, particularly on an independence referendum, are watching those developments and have comparable views to Brexit when it comes to the size and the treatment that the more nationalist and Scottish National Party would see under Brexit? Thank you.
Interesting that second question is the easy question. Maybe we'll collect 2 more here in the front.
Good morning, Minister. Thank you for being here. My name is Bobby Cunningham. I'm a note-taking and observing member of the Ad Hoc Committee to Protect the Good Friday Agreement. Obviously, we are very supportive of a deal on the protocol that will protect the Good Friday Agreement. But if I may, I'd like to ask your thoughts on an alternative scenario, one in which the DUP would not support any deal that is reached and would actually prefer direct rule from London. So you're possibly under the same constraints as the previous question, but if you could get to that, we would love to hear your thoughts, and thank you again for being here.
Maybe that puts enough on the table for now. So
Yeah.
Political situation,
No, look,
Scotland,
they
DUP.
are they're very fair questions, actually. And you know what, answering questions like that should not be out of bounds. This is, if you ask somebody who is a unionist, whether they think Northern Ireland should remain as part of the United Kingdom, it's a very normal question. If you ask somebody who categorizes themselves as a nationalist as to when you think, a referendum on Irish reunification should happen, it's all of a sudden hugely controversial, And I don't think it should be like that. The whole point of the Good Friday Agreement is that if you're a nationalist or if you're a unionist, if you categorize yourself as British or Irish or both, or if you're something in between, that you can talk openly about those dreams and aspirations without feeling that you're somehow put into the sort of camp of an extremist I'm somebody who would love to see the reunification of the island that I live on at some point in the future. Do I think we should be talking about setting a date for a border poll right now? No, I don't. I think that we need to be thinking in sequence here. The first thing we need to do is to try to rebuild relationships because they've been really damaged in recent years. We need to try to get the basis of the peace agreement functioning again, which is institutions that people agree to be part of and work together in. If we can do that and start to rebuild those relationships, well then, over time, we do need to have the conversation about what the future holds for Northern Ireland. Does the Good Friday Agreement provide a basis for forever? Are there amendments needed? Is there changes happening in Northern Ireland that we need to adapt to? We have to have these conversations. But it's very hard to be jumping to those conversations without putting some kind of a platform in place first that stabilizes Northern Ireland. So for me, as somebody who believes that reunification in the future would be a good thing for everybody in Northern Ireland and on the island of Ireland, and ultimately a good thing for the relationship between Britain and Ireland. But should we try to rush to that outcome? I don't think so. But we've got to recognize that is a legitimate aspiration, just as it's a very legitimate aspiration for a unionist to want to protect the union that they believe in. But I think that given the strains and pressures of the last number of years, given the fact that we have no institutions functioning right now, no executive, no assembly, no north-south bodies, some people aren't even talking to each other, then surely the place to start is how do we actually start to reset these relationships so that people can start to trust each other, talk to each other, agree to work together, agree that the Good Friday Agreement and its institutions is the best way to serve the interests of Northern Ireland for now. That's where I think we need to be. But we can't, we can't categorize people on the basis of their aspirations for the future and tell them not to talk about it. That's not what a peace agreement that's based on respect for different identity should be about. So, and then on these protocol questions, I think that, and this is a really difficult issue for unionism, and I don't pretend it isn't. Because at the time of these Brexit questions being really difficult to resolve, we've also seen a change in the makeup of numbers in Northern Ireland that whereby unionism is clearly no longer in the majority, nor is nationalism, by the way. But we have these new dynamics in Northern Ireland which are difficult to adjust to. But surely, the protection of the union is not best served by unionism trying to force the will of the minority in Northern Ireland on the majority of people there. Surely they can't see that as a stable basis for the union in the future. Even though, the principle of consent is important, the principle of consent is important, and cross-community support, which is a separate thing, is important in terms of, domestic legislation and devolved decision-making in Northern Ireland and so on. We have to find a way here of recognizing that Brexit is difficult for everybody, not just unionism. There are many nationalists and many unionists, by the way, who didn't want to leave the European Union at all. But it's being forced on them because of a broader democratic decision of the United Kingdom. And if you ask in Northern Ireland today, a strong majority of people do not want to see the protocol collapse. Like 71% of people recognize that the protocol isn't going to be binned, But I think a strong majority would like to see pragmatism and flexibility in terms of how the protocol is implemented to recognize legitimate concerns from the unionist community and from business community. And that's where we need to get to. Will it be enough for some? No, it won't. And will others, by the way, want to bypass all of this and move straight to a border poll? Some people will. But I think I hope anyway we can put an agreement in place that will get the support of the majority of all sides to say, look, let's put this issue behind us. Let's try to get these institutions back up and running again, and let's deal with the complexity of some of the other challenges that we need to face together in terms of a changing and evolving Northern Ireland through the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement, which were set up to try to manage that change in the future should it happen.
Minister, I'm really glad that these questions got asked, and I really appreciate your frankness in answering them and answering all the questions today. I've really enjoyed this exchange. Thank you so much for coming.
Clearly my answers were too long, because a whole lot of people didn't get that wasn't intentional, by the way. But,
it's been impressed on me that you have to be in the car at 10 sharp, so I'm going to let you go. But thank you really very much, Minister Coveney. Thank you all for coming, for these excellent questions, and we hope to see you here again soon.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.